we have to talk about the Josh Kroenke press conference that happened on Monday this week. A lot of people thought this was going to be a big announcement, but I didn't. As soon as the firings happened, and then Josh Kroenke put out the short video that we talked about on the last podcast from Altitude Sports, I was immediately asking people, like, is Josh going to hold a press conference? Like, if he does, like, let me know. Reporter friends, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't have to let me know because the announcement was just made late on Sunday that there would be a press conference the next day. And Josh was just there answering questions about firing the head coach and the GM 3 games before the playoffs. Like, I think that it should be an expectation that a press conference happens when you do something this big. I know there were a lot of stories after the Kings fired Mike Brown about how upset Fox was at the fact that nobody from ownership or the front office spoke to the media in the aftermath of firing Mike Brown for over a month, leaving interim head coach Doug Christie and the players to answer all questions post game about this happening in subsequent post games, right? That's not their job. Like, you're the figurehead of the organization. When you make big decisions like this, you should be answering questions to the press.
Yeah. He was saying he wanted to make sure he could give us information and set anything straight that needed to be setting straight. I don't know if you feel like that happened or not, but
I think that it did to an extent, and in retrospect, it did feel like perhaps he wasn't going to do a press conference at all, if not for some of the stories that came out even after we did our podcast about what was going on behind the scenes, and in particular a couple of details that he really wanted to try to set the record straight about his own motivations and his own thinking. I think and he said this in the presser, like, when something this big happens and you don't speak to the media immediately, there is an information void, and then people will try to fill that void. So he's trying to go around that. So let's jump into it. First note that I have here is on the timeline. I think this was this was news to people because there were reports that came out last week that Josh had considered firing both Calvin and Malone around the All-Star break, and then hesitated to because of the 8-game win streak that ensued. And he kind of alluded to that in that short video that he did last week with Altitude, where he said
they're winning with masks issues.
Exactly. But he also said there was another time this season around Thanksgiving break where he contemplated doing the very same thing. That time he didn't, because he was sort of rationalizing in his head based on, like, Jamal and Jokic, in particular Jamal, always have not always have slow starts, but Jamal always has a slow start. But in particular, this past season, he was injured post-playoffs, took time off, ramped up for the Olympics, had to take time off from that too. And then we had, to be fair, an early preseason because we had the Abu Dhabi games. Yeah. And so that's what was going through Josh's mind. He's like, we're just, like, taking a while to get rolling. And at that point, I think the Nuggets were hovering around 500 on their record. So I could understand having concern there as well.
We've had, like, a decently high seed the whole season, but it's been really hard to evaluate this team, just especially from the outside. So Josh is going to have a hard time until you get a handful of games, but he also has been seeing what's going on with the team. Although, I don't know, he kind of expressed how, we talked about this last episode too, where you want to be an owner who's kind of hands-off, but also hands-on in the right balance, because you want to let people do what they do, but you got to, like, hold people accountable if something's not going right. And it seems like that probably slipped away from him a bit.
He did say specifically that after he went to the locker room following the Pacers game, it wasn't the loss, and that game was the fourth loss in the 4-game losing streak that the Nuggets went on before these firing outs, obviously. But it wasn't the loss that got him, but the fact that the locker room was so flat after that game. Like, have the guys just, like, given up on the season at that point.
Yeah.
is my interpretation of what he was kind of saying there. Like, you just don't want things to get to that point, and he felt like things had slipped too far. And he definitely put a lot of it on him, like,
Yeah.
which, whether you agree or not, he's like, I needed to either be here to realize, like, he's mad at himself for not realizing how bad it had gotten in the in between times between the Thanksgiving break and the All-Star break, the two times he considered making this move mid-season, and then obviously between All-Star break and when he finally decides to fire both Michael Malone and Calvin Booth. So yeah, I thought he was pretty clear and like, this is what I was thinking. So that, I thought that was a useful, section of it. The other thing that he talked about here was wanting people who were, quote, policing the culture and pushing it forward daily. I think, and that goes to what you were just talking about, Will, with the trying to strike the right balance between being, not being an absentee governor, but giving enough space. And I'm not saying that he's correct in this balance, but wanting leaders, both general manager and head coach, and those two working in tandem towards that goal, who were more accountable for the culture. Like, he kept coming back to the culture. Like, that was like kind of the thing he kept trying to hammer home about what had slipped within the organization and how it was affecting the locker room all this time. What did you make of that part in particular, where he, was kind of like, I needed to be more involved, but it also kind of sounded like he didn't want to have to be a babysitter
Yeah.
for these two guys? Like, that was my interpretation.
I think that is probably the part where he does have culpability, is that he wasn't able to. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine how he would have fixed the situation with Malone and Booth. But if you like give a direct like mandate on direction and culture, like he's seemingly saying, maybe he could have policed the culture and pushed it forward more, or at least gotten them out so that the culture was at least not being fought over. Whether that was just like putting Adelman in the interim coach around the All-Star break, if that's what he wanted to do sooner, so that then this wasn't an issue. But
It sounds like whenever he was going to do this, either Thanksgiving or All-Star break, or when he eventually did, it was going to be both of them, like,
yeah,
regardless of when.
for sure.
And he basically stressed that each time. It wasn't just one or the other.
And it's like every NBA insider has talked about how they haven't really got along. Obviously, this kind of talk confirms that too with Josh. We don't really know all the specific details, but we know that they had a difference in philosophy. And I think Josh being there to say, like, Malone, like, you gotta, if he, whatever it was that Malone was doing, if he wasn't playing Pickett, if Josh thought maybe that he should have done that or whatever, or he should have told Booth, like, just because we're not playing Pickett doesn't mean we don't believe in him as a player. Like, he'll get his chance. He's still young. I don't know, like, what he could have done, but clearly, I think, like, firing them is probably the right move, and that just needed to happen sooner to, like, get rid of this power struggle. And yeah.
It also sounded like, because he said this, that they had met, the three of them, Josh with Malone and Booth, periodically or just at different points. We know that happened over the summer because they talked about it at that end of season presser that we've that we broke down last year, about the differences in both guys' approaches and all of that. And it sounds like that also happened this year at times, perhaps like earlier in the season, things like that. But it sounds like Josh was like, in between those meetings, like, it was just not happening.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he does try to, I have this a little bit later in my notes here, but he does try to talk about how the next time, like, new GM, new coach, whatever, he wants to be more involved in the transition. Like, his rationale, whether right or wrong, I don't necessarily agree with it, but his rationale is, these two guys just like didn't really understand each other and like where each other was like really coming from. And like, he compared it to a locker room and like players coming together and learning about each other and where they come from in their different walks of life so that they could really understand where each other was coming from, whether they agree with them or not. They'd know like each other was coming from, like where they were coming from, basically from a good place. Like, this is why I think the way that I do. And he felt like if he was there more involved in the transition, like I guess he's talking about, or at least contrasting what the future will be like to when Calvin took over. And maybe that was a more hands-off transition. You're hiring internally. It's somebody that you expect, regardless of any disagreements they may have had in the past. Like, they know each other. They've known each other for years at this point within the organization, worked, around each other, even if not together. So maybe he was a little bit more hands off in that. I don't know that being more hands on in the transition would have been the solve. We talked about this very thing over the summer when the articles were coming out about the discord between the front office and the coaching staff. It's like there's going to be some amount of tension, whether healthy or not, between the motivations of a head coach and the motivations of a general manager with respect to timeline and like their main sort of mandates and responsibilities, right? But that every NBA team has to deal with the exact same thing. I do think it's a little bit different in this instance, and there are other teams certainly that have a similar situation where you have a head coach that was not hired by the general manager, and has in fact been there longer. That's pretty rare, I think, just because of how much turnover there is at the head coach position
so
in
much
the NBA.
easier to just fire a coach.
Yeah.
And he was one of the Malone is one of the only coaches who's been with a roster for considerable amount of time, like Popovich and Kerr. And yeah, GMs love to have their guy because then their vision is going to be put into place on the court. But obviously that wasn't happening. Wasn't happening in this case. And I know Josh looks at them on a human level too, because he expressed how he had certain feelings and almost felt crazy firing them at this time in the season. I just think it's clear that he should have done it sooner based on what he was saying. And that was definitely the part where he was like, I needed to be there probably closer, but he probably
to realize how bad it gotten. It seems like he needed, because of how close he was to both of these guys, it seemed like he needed that extra push of like, oh shit, it's gotten this bad.
Yeah, exactly.
And without that, he wasn't going to make that move mid-season.
Yeah, I just wish that it did happen sooner so that we could have seen or just had a bigger sample of how the team would have played with if this renewed energy is real, which it feels like it is, but it's hard to like.
I mean,
really,
of course, it feels like it is while it's still going, right?
Yeah, it's hard to quantify, you know what I mean? But it's also like we're getting closer to the playoffs, and I think the players are excited about that too. But I wish we could see.
I mean, they weren't excited about it at the Pacers game.
Well, yeah. Well, Malone hadn't been fired yet, but that Pacers game really was like a down game, and I usually we lost to the Wolves right before that in the double overtime, and that was like the most.
Was the Wolves the one immediately before Pacers? I thought the Wolves was the first game of the losing streak because
there was another game. There was another game.
We lost the Spurs game.
Yeah.
Wolves, Spurs, and then something else, and then Pacers was the last one.
Yeah. But it was just, I think a lot of fans expressed how the Wolves loss was the most frustrating loss because it's the Wolves and it was double overtime and Jokic had 60 points or whatever. Or how much? No, he didn't have 60 in that game. And so that's frustrating. But the Pacers game, I think
60 or 61. It was a lot of points. Yeah.
But the Pacers game really depressed me particularly.
Oh, the Warriors. That was the other one. I was like,
oh, yeah, the Warriors.
Lost the Warriors. Like, give me a break, man.
Yeah.
Like, you see this team right now? The team is hanging on by a thread.
So it's not surprising to me that he was like, all right, this is definitely it. Because it did feel like it watching it. Like, it's crossed the line.
And I fell asleep in the middle of the early games, the East games that day. And I woke up right before halftime of the Pacers game, like, okay, we're up. let's see what's happening. And I'm like, oh, lethargic defense as usual, like whatever. And then I just saw Lily dwindle over the course of the second
Yeah.
half, and like it was just bad from like everybody.
If we
It
had
was
won that game, I would have said this was like the ugliest loss of the season. Like it was just like it was despicable, like Ryan says, you know.
despicable. Yes,
Anyway,
despicable. I did want to comment on this part though from Josh, because he wanted to take a lot of accountability, it seemed like, in this presser, or at least sound like it, right? Like you want to sound like you're taking accountability, unless you're Nico Harrison. Um the Cronkies, I think, were incredibly messy over the course of the last few years. And this is information I'm gathering, or I've gathered from a variety of sources, including the Athletic piece from Tony Jones that came out last week. There was one that we talked about on our podcast, but then Tony came out with another one with Sam Amick the next day, as well as an ESPN piece that I believe was a collaboration with Ramona Shelburne and a couple other writers at ESPN. So definitely check those out if you want the more details. But the timeline is incredibly sketch, in that we learned that Calvin Booth wanted Malone gone as soon as he became GM. Like that was part of the Tony Jones piece, I believe. He was like, Malone needs to go, and has wanted Malone gone at different points throughout
that's
the.
crazy.
Oh, I thought you knew this. I'm
I didn't
sorry.
know
I
that.
wasn't.
No,
This was not. I didn't mean to be breaking news to you.
no, I
There
didn't
was
read
a
that
lot
article. So
of. There was a lot of stuff that came out last week. Bennett Durando also had a great piece. So,
yeah, I read that
um,
one. Wanting Malone
Calvin
gone
has
right
wanted
away is like
right away,
inexcusable to me.
right? Which is like, I wouldn't say inexcusable. Like I get it. New GM, you want to hire your own head coach, and at that point, the team had not yet won a championship, but you also had no reason to fire Malone. Like there was no. They were coming off of the 48 win season without Jamal and MPJ at that point.
If yeah,
They lost to the Warriors in 5 in the playoffs. That was the summer that he brought in KCP Bruce. He drafted Christian
Christian
and
and Peyton.
Peyton, and um, I totally lost my train of thought. Calvin did a lot of things that summer. Oh, right. Got Jokic to sign the Supermax extension. That was like the big news of the summer for the Denver Nuggets, right? Is like Jokic is staying. Great. Uh, the thing is, they decided to promote the GM that wanted to fire the head coach. You'd think, okay, we're promoting internally, because they seem to really like this whole like stability and organizational alignment thing, and we'll get to that theme from Josh's presser as well. But they did promote a guy who wanted the head coach gone and then didn't fire the head coach. So that's a thing. That's like existing tension now heightened because one of these guys has power. Great. After they won the championship, they extended Malone. I mean, what else are you going to do in that situation? They went 16-4. It was a dominant playoff run. You're not going to fire your head coach. You're definitely going to extend him, because I think his contract was up at that point. They did not extend his assistant coaches, but it was a question that I had for a friend of the show, Matt Moore. Like, hey, is this a thing? Because it was like just like a footnote in like one of the articles I read from Ryan Blackburn following the championships. Like, okay, this is normal. Like assistants don't get long-term contracts. That's not too weird. Same thing this year. No long-term extensions for any of the assistant coaching staff. All right, so now you have head coach who the GM wants gone, who's now been extended. His assistant coaching staff has not been extended. And we also, just like a total side note to this timeline, is that Malone thought is it Mike Penberthy, the shooting coach?
Shooting coach.
Who was hired by Calvin Booth, which I learned in the course of all of these articles coming out about the tension between the two of them, was like, no, like I'm supposed to hire coaches. Like that's a coach. I hire coaches. That's like out of Calvin's purview. Which kind of colors all those times last season when Malone was asked about the free throw shooting issues that the team had last year, and how he kept shouting out like Penberthy, like he was kind of joking at him. And I didn't realize that, like, oh, he's not a Malone guy, actually. Like he's not under like Malone's sort of circle of trust, which was funny. All right. Assistants not extended. Josh and Stan and whoever else they're consulting about this, we're just kind of hoping that Malone and Booth could get along, which is not a crazy thing. Like, okay, you guys have some differing motivations. Every head coach and every GM is going to have, some of these tensions, but we're going to figure out how to make it healthy tension and, put this whole thing together. But then came the crown jewel of all of this, which was they offered an extension to Calvin Booth at the beginning of this season, or before the season started. That was apparently a lowball offer, which doesn't surprise me because of all the stories I've heard about the Cronkies being cheap, especially when it comes to, staffing things. Uh, and then they pulled their offer when Calvin was like, no, like, I deserve more than that, which really colors the news that Thanksgiving was the first time Josh thought about firing both of them, despite the fact that a month earlier they had just offered Calvin Booth an extension. So, like,
Well, they were mad that he didn't want to accept it, and so it's time to get him out of there. It's like, okay, you don't
they were
want
just
it,
like,
you're done.
we're thinking about getting rid of Malone. Like, we were gonna let this guy expire anyway, so may as well just like
Yeah.
kick him out.
Set up the new GM to not be feuding with Malone. Like, as sad as that is. I mean, you could have maybe collaborated with Malone to bring in a GM who shared his
But it
vision,
sounds
but
like the Thanksgiving thing was like they were thinking about firing both of them.
yeah, but
Yeah,
I'm just saying if you were
sure.
to, or I was saying like I like the idea of kind of starting over to get two guys who are aligned rather than risk a new GM coming in and repeating this thing with Malone.
Yeah, no,
But
that's fair.
but I was like there was a chance you could have collaborated with Malone and like found a GM who was going to work with him, but I just think like there's a lot of this that's natural where chemistry and people tire each other, and a lot of it that was intentional behavior that was questionable because of these bickerings and these feuds.
The reason I wanted to bring up this timeline, Will, is the whole thing like set off like real alarm bells for me in terms of like who was paid when, and it. They're all reports also were that Calvin was incredibly displeased with the fact that first that they lowballed him and that extension talks had not progressed forward after that throughout the season, and he was very vocal about that throughout the organization. Like, people were very you know so that's the thing. But the reason I wanted to mention it to you is that we talked about this extensively when we talked about Jamal's contract extension and the way you do business with people.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to get your thoughts just on both the precarity that came with for the assistant coaching staff. Not only not getting like long-term contracts, but like just being on expiring deals.
Yeah.
In a situation where the GM has already like tried to hire a shooting coach, and there were reports of like other people that he'd hired who like came in and left and like whatever, I don't know, like it's all very messy. But then also a GM who is getting lowballed by ownership, and then having that offer pulled, or yeah, getting lowballed and then having his offer pulled, and what that does to the internal just dynamics, just on the staffing side. Like, forget how it trickles down to players, but like what that does for the organization internally.
I mean, the idea that the Cronkies are lowballing a GM does concern me because I think it's a very important role because you want a really strong leader in that position if you want someone to navigate the CBA and trades and drafts and scouting. That's very important. So, but that's like their style. Everyone knows that the Cronkies do this. They do pride
That's why
them.
these reports didn't surprise me. I was like, yep,
Yeah,
I believe that.
they pride themselves on being able to find these like up and coming people who have talent in scouting and etc. But we're lucky that they lowballed Calvin Booth in this case, at least in my opinion. I know like Calvin Booth's the easier one to criticize because he's been with the team the least amount, especially with compared to Jokic and Malone. But so he's an easy punching bag. But I didn't really trust him too much after last season in the moves that were made, and then not making moves around the deadline, as difficult as it was. Apparently, yeah, we talked about last episode, he tried to trade Jamal and Josh Kroenke vetoed that. So it's just Calvin Booth really did try to like reshape
Which
everything.
Josh was not asked about that at this
Yeah,
press
it's kind of
conference, but he
interesting.
was asked about the MPJ stuff, which
I
I
wonder if
found
he
interesting.
said
I wish somebody would have asked him
he
about
was
the
like
Jamal
no
thing.
Jamal questions. That would have been bad.
No, I doubt it.
But yeah, it just seems like Booth really tried to reshape everything, like shooting coaches, sending players to go work with the shooting coach on other days. That's not official practice days or whatever.
We know that Zeke and Pickett now, when they were working with each other in LA, like there were reports about what they did this summer. I think this was just coming from the coaching staff, like in practice media in
Mhm.
preseason, they talked about this, or maybe Pickett mentioned it. They were working with Penberthy in LA, and that's like, okay, like that's, I mean, good. Like they definitely clearly worked on things, and that's all fine and dandy. But I doubt that like went over well with the not just Malone, like the entire coaching staff. That's just like there are like things that we want you to work on, and it might not be the same things that you're working on with. And this is also like all of this is playing out with the backdrop also of now we can move on to how this affects the players have their individual like player development coaches and trainers that they work with over the summer and throughout the season that might be in conflict with whatever the organization wants them to do, or might work together with the organization what they want them to do, but the organization doesn't even agree on what they want them to do.
Yeah.
And so it just gets, again, like the word is messy.
I just don't like what I've been hearing about Booth's leadership style and like siphoning off resources to certain people and like collecting little groups of people to do
Yeah,
whatever
that
it is he
doesn't
wants to
sound great.
do. And I'm just like, the Nuggets had Jokic for 7, 8 seasons before he even took over. And yeah, we hadn't won a championship, but we were well on our way. He did bring in Bruce and KCP. People debated, did Tim Connolly have that kind of lined up and then Booth just executed it, or did he 100% do that on his own? I don't really know. But and that was a great move for us. But I just think Booth should have seen that the Nuggets already like had a culture and had something going. And while he maybe had a vision for what he needed to implement, he should have done it in a way that was like supplementing and not trying to like reshape everything to his vision and his whim. Because I don't really like the direction the team went, especially these last 2 seasons. I know that it's really difficult to build with limited assets, and we're right on the edge of the second apron. But yeah, I just think it's I'm really glad that we moved on from him. I wish I had it sooner. I feel bad for Malone, but it sounds like it was a good move too. And I'm glad that Josh Kroenke is maybe gonna be more hands-on, though I did laugh a little bit when he was like, my basketball instinct kicks in.
I know. He's like, my basketball instinct kicks in, and I immediately know the stats of like the
He's like, I know
success rate
all
of
this
McDonald's
stuff.
All-American.
And it's like, okay, yeah,
All right,
I don't
buddy.
know.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's about the boot stuff, but the reason I wanted to point out this timeline is that all of this stuff about what Calvin was doing and how he was reshaping the organization to his, let's say, work style and his workflow was happening, and yet the Conkeys did offer him an extension. Like like in a different universe, he accepts that offer, and all this stuff continues. But they offered him that extension. If they wanted to move on from him early before the season started, I wouldn't imagine they do that. But you could argue like, oh, they lowballed him because they knew he'd say no. I don't know. Whatever. I don't know the motivations behind, how those negotiations went or anything like that. But uh it's kind of like I don't know how much of what Calvin was doing the Cronkies actually disagree with, as much as just the fact that there was some bickering between him and Malone.
Yeah,
And that will probably inform whatever the answer to that will probably inform whatever they do next. So let's talk about a little bit about what's happening next. Ben Tenzer, who was the general manager of the Grand Rapids Gold, the Nuggets G League affiliate, and he's previously worked in the front office, is going to be the interim general manager. He's, quote, a CBA expert. And Josh said, I just know that Ben knows what we need. And I'm like,
Maybe Calvin
interesting.
wasn't listening to him.
I don't know. I doubt that, because it sounds like they were fine with most of what Calvin was doing. Josh also said that they are going to hold off on a GM search or coaching search until after the playoffs, which I was a little bit disappointed to hear, although I kind of understand it, especially in the case of coach, like, because you're probably going to be interviewing candidates and doing all of that while David Adelman, who is a potential candidate, is still like actively coaching the
Yeah.
team
Yeah.
in the playoffs.
You just remove the toxicity. Don't create any more, you know?
Exactly. I kind of understand it for general manager, though it is rough because of the timeline. Like, we're entering the month before all of this stuff having to do with the pre-draft process, pre-draft workouts and things like that. The Nuggets don't have any picks, but there's things with undrafted free agents that could be, a thing. And who knows? Like, we might end up with a pick if they made moves that
Yeah.
involve trades with our players.
I mean, hopefully, like,
Yeah.
this is somewhat standard at least, and they probably have an idea in mind of like who might be out there. So I know they're going to do an extensive search, but I bet you they like have some traction on that. At least I would hope. But
I do think the fact that they sort of like temporarily promote Ben Tenzer to the GM job means it's probably not going to be Tommy Belsedis as the replacement, because Tommy is currently the assistant general manager of the Denver Nuggets. And I feel like if they were like, you'll probably be GM anyway, they would have just made him interim.
yeah.
So they're probably going to go externally for that. There have been reports that Matt Lloyd, who is currently the general manager and the right-hand man, general manager of the Minnesota Timberwolves and right-hand man to Tim Conley, is somebody who's been rumored. I believe it was The Athletic that rumored that. How much do you think the outcome of the playoffs will actually change, if at all, what the Kroenkes are looking for in a GM?
That is like the big question, and why, again, another point of why I wish this happened sooner, because we were saying in the offseason coming into this season that this was like a big, like almost prove it year for Booth and Malone, and like at the time Jamal
and the players.
We were talking about him and like maybe Mike, but so now
Mike
it's like,
said at the beginning of the season, it was in the Ramona Shelburne piece, that locker room interview quote about how we know that like they'll blow it up if we don't like get it this year.
And I think that's expected. And so you're trying to make a decision based on this season, but now it's like Malone's out at this weird time. Players don't have a ton of time to make a radical change, though we hope there is like this spark that everyone's talking about. I already had us as a second round out, I guess, at our peak, and we ended up in the 4 seed. The Clippers people are saying this is almost like a second round series because the 4-5 is technically like close in quality.
Like, I know, but like, it's basically like a second round. It's like, it's not though. It's the first round.
Yeah, it is the first round. So it's like coming to conclusions based off now this situation, which I didn't really foresee, is very different and hard to pinpoint. And it's like, if Mike has a really bad series, is that really enough to make a huge decision? But on the other hand, there's only so many avenues forward. And I think almost no matter what happens, we may have to trade Mike anyway, because it's like, who else are you going to trade? How are you going to get anyone different in to play defense? And I think we all know we suck to defense. If we lose the Clipper series, it's probably going to be because of the defense. So I think that's going to be an obvious decision to make. And Josh Kroenke said that the report that he would never trade Mike because of the Missouri connections is overstated. And you don't necessarily want to be like,
did he use the word overstated?
No, I'm just saying that to sum it up.
Okay.
But
I like your word better, because I think he did it like a unequivocal denial. And I'm like, I don't believe you.
He's like, of course I would trade Mike. Like, that's a weird question to answer. You don't want to be like, yeah, I would trade Mike in a second if I had to, because it's like, You
He
don't want to upset
also
Mike, but
the answer sounded like a little bit rehearsed because
yeah,
he was like, I would laugh if it weren't so insulting.
yeah. Which
It was like a little bit of like, we're still waiting for the denial. And then he goes with like the kind of over the top denial to where I'm like, okay,
yeah.
that's fine. Like it's not that I like don't believe him, but I kind of don't believe him. I thought Jeff Morton, who went on Ryan Blackburn's show after this presser, really like hit the nail on the head with this, where he's like, Josh seemed particularly irked about the reports that like the Missouri connection was the reason that the Cronkies would veto any trade with MPJ, because it went at his like credibility and his ability to make decisions that are best for the team as a whole, which, you know, would be really bad for somebody in his position as the governor of this team. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, whether it's like a little bit true or not. But the other thing about the playoffs is just like, I don't know, honestly, especially now with like where the Nuggets are at and who they're playing, if the playoffs will substantively change the direction that the Cronkies want to take the team. Because to me, it sounds like Josh is more concerned with trying to bring the culture back to a point that it was. It's very like make the Nuggets great again kind of mindset right now. Where he's like very focused on the culture and like bringing it back to a point. And that was very in line with kind of on court wise what David Adelman said in one of his post game pressers last week about the team being in a state of sort of rediscovery and not reinvention. It's like a return to the way they were, or at least that's the attempt. And that I don't know that that's going to work, even if they got there.
I mean, the only reason why
Yeah.
I don't have as many problems with that framing is just because we did win a championship. So it's like, of course, you want to get back to the way we were.
No, I buy it. Like you have,
Yeah.
there's enough there to say that's the path that we're choosing, at least for the remainder of this season. The other
Yeah.
thing that Josh has said over and over again is like, you know, this whole like, I wanted to rip the Band-Aid off and like take all the pressure off for this season. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, if the worst case scenario, Nuggets flame out to the Clippers in 4 and everybody was bad but Jokic, like, what do you do?
I don't know how aware players are of where they stand with the GM. Like, there could have been players who were like, I know Booth's leaning on trading me, and
Yeah.
if I don't do well in this series, then it's really gonna fuck with me. And now with him gone, like maybe MPJ can shoot better because he's not worried about Booth breathing down his neck. Unfortunately, I think the reality of the Nuggets roster is that Mike's going to be under pressure no matter what. But I mean, not because of any performance
No,
thing.
I know.
But I mean, it just like gets me all back to thinking about whether the core four should be broken up and all that. And yeah, it's like what could happen in the playoffs that would further solidify any opinion on that. Like if we get swept by the Clippers, obviously someone's going to get traded, I would say, or they would be crazy.
Is it obvious though? Not that they should, because I think a lot of fans like rightly are like, this team needs a shakeup with the roster, but I don't know that ownership thinks that right now.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Right? Because and understandably, Josh also said in that section about MPJ, like, hey, he's kind of protesting that he would have like vetoed any Mike trade because of Mizzou connections. But he basically admits that he vetoed a Mike deal when he said, and I would veto any trade of, you know, like a core member, like a big move like that when they're in a place where they lack, quote, organizational alignment.
Yeah.
And I feel like regardless of how this playoffs goes, just based on Josh Kroenke's words, like regardless of how it goes, regardless of how it ends, that they're going to be more focused on trying to fix things internally than making a big move with the roster. He also said in that same portion, lacking organizational alignment, and when we're, quote, not getting the most out of our roster, which I think was like a shot both at Booth and Malone. I mean, kind of in one, and like their performance this like what they've been doing this season. So I kind of feel like they're just that's
the logic,
that's where my mind is.
The logic of that makes sense because you want to evaluate this as clearly as you can. And if the culture was flat, which is what he observed and what we all observed, we know that the roster wasn't playing up to what they could because the effort has been lacking and has been apparent. So, if this is a step to hopefully evaluate and get more questions answered, that's great. But this is such a short time window to do that. I know it is like the most important time of the season because it's the playoffs, but what can you really glean from this? I don't know. I almost feel like, to me, I feel like the answer already is apparent regardless of what happens. But because I don't see us winning the championship, but outside of that, I don't know.
I think we have a little bit about how Josh is going to move in this because of how he dealt with this Malone and Calvin situation. He even said himself, like, I shouldn't have let my personal connections to these two men let me waver. And I think it was like I said before, it took that 4-game losing streak and walking into the locker room after the Pacers game and seeing how flat it was for him to realize, like, oh, okay, I got to do this. I'm not rooting for this. And I don't think anybody should be. But if you wanted a big roster shakeup, you might want the Nuggets to go out in spectacularly embarrassing fashion to the Clippers, because I don't know that anything short of that would make them think that the immediate issue isn't we got to fix stuff internally, we got to fix our culture, because that's what they're focused on right now.
Yeah.
And I think that anything less would serve to confirm that.
Well, I think if, we're going to talk Nuggets Clippers in a second, but if Mike gets really picked on and his defense is terrible, which is likely, it could just go right into the narrative that he could be a trade piece to bring in some better defenders. So you can get your answer from that right there, even though it's one series. So
you want him in that situation, even if you want him gone. You want him to shoot well, at least, because you don't want the trade value to tank.
Yeah, for sure.
As a result of this. All right. Well, if you like our content, please remember to click the like button and hit the subscribe button as well. Hit the notification bell, and you can leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, or Amazon Music. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Our social links are in the description. And always remember, especially in the playoffs, winning is fun and losing sucks.